Okay, let's begin our study on Ezra with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, again, we come before you once again to study your word, to look at part of the foundation of Adventism, the prophecy of the 2300 days, and also its connection to the 70 weeks and to all other prophecies. And as we look at this foundational truth within Adventism, we ask, Lord, that we can have a open heart and mind. Help us also to find ways that we can share this with others, with those in the Adventist church, and others looking for truth. And give us wisdom and understanding. Thank you for hearing our prayer, for being with us. May your Holy Spirit be our teacher, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So welcome, everyone. Now, the study on the chronology of Ezra is one of the studies that I really think is an effective study that we can share with Seventh-day Adventists. It is one of those things that most Adventists who do understand the 2300 days fail to really understand how to present the start of the 2300 days. And I've seen all kinds of explanations that people will have. But what we're going to look at here as we go through Ezra, we're going to start looking at chapter 7 and onward. And I'm going to share my screen here, is that so these are the notes which we're using. We're basically on chapter 3. Got to get to the beginning of this. And I'm going to read through some of this, probably because it's a little more clear than I can usually do just speaking off the cuff, though we can definitely discuss it as we go through it. So we're dealing with Artaxerxes' decree and the commencement of the 70 weeks and the 2300 days. So as I said, most Adventists, they know about these prophecies, but very few can actually give, they might even know the date 457 BC. I find lots of Adventists who don't even know that date. But how to prove that is not well understood. I remember going a few years ago to an Adventist book center and looking at the books addressing prophecy. And you have two kinds. You have the scholarly books that deal with all the details, and those are for the scholars. Not many Adventists read those. And then you have their popular books, which really don't address a prophecy in anything other than a cursory way. There isn't really a lot. So the scholarly world has a certain way of thinking and writing that is not really biblical, even though they may be biblical scholars. And so when you deal with Adventist scholarship, they tend to actually work on a type of skepticism about even their own ideas. So that is one of the rules of scholarship, is that you can't be sure about anything that you're saying. And we remember that Jesus spoke with authority and not as the scribes. And the scribes had that same type of thing, this sort of surmising and what if and this and that, rather than just having something on the sure word of prophecy. Now, when we start with 457 BC, I'm going to read this here. William Miller first saw that the going forth of the commandment was in the spring of 457 BC. According to Ezra 7:9, they left Babylon on the first day of the first month and arrived in Jerusalem on the first day of the 5th month in Artaxerxes' 7th year. They mistakenly believed that the 7th year of Artaxerxes began in the spring of 457 BC and ended in the spring of 456. So there was different views that were held at different times by the Millerites. And when I say that they began in the spring and ended in the spring, they didn't even really think that at first. Sometimes they just didn't think about it. It was in 457 BC was his 7th year, is what they understood. Now, some of the sources that they had, even when they used the year 457 BC, were using the astronomical count where you have a 0 year. So they might say 457 BC, but they actually meant 458. And this confused people. So even within the Millerite movement, they sometimes fluctuated on how they described the beginning of the decree. But Miller was always just using the year 457 BC. But at some points, they did think it was from the spring of 457 to the spring of 456. Miller believed that the 70 weeks ended in the spring of 33 AD with the crucifixion of Christ, exactly 490 years from their commencement. The point being that Miller believed the 2300 days to commence in the 7th year of Artaxerxes and to terminate after 2300 years had passed, about the year 1843. So this is always a thing that puzzled me about Miller, is that he believed that from the 12th day of the first month, and we're going to see that when we look at it, in 457 BC, to the 12th day of the first month in 33 AD, was a period of 490 years to the day. But when it came to the 2300 days, and in changing those into years, he never had an exact point, end point for when the 2300 days was going to end. That he believed that Jesus would come back sometime about the year 1843. So obviously, as they approached the time, they started to become more certain about when that was, or at least more exact in their calculations. They tried to figure out, how can we show exactly? And when they did that, it actually brought about an understanding that there was no 0 year, which they hadn't at first recognized. So when they had their disappointment on April 19th, 1844, they actually, long before that, more than a year, had already understood that there was no 0 year. The disappointment that they experienced had to do with the termination of the periods that they thought they ended in the spring. And then later they realized they ended in the fall. But there was a mistake on the 1843 chart, and that was the mistake where the Lord held his hand over, where they at that time when the chart was made, they had not yet determined that there was no 0 year. So it's a little bit of a complex history. So if anybody has questions about that, you obviously can ask them. But we're going to go through and read here a bit more. Maybe any questions you have might be cleared up. So I've sort of summarized that section. Now, when it comes to the scholarly arguments, in its reevaluation of the calculation of the 2300 days, the Seventh-day Adventist scholarship has tried to find a basis that can convince the scholars of other denominations. So you're a scholar, you speak a scholarly language, and the people that you're trying to convince are other scholars, because that's your group of peers. You're not necessarily writing to convince the common person. And so scholarship becomes very, very technical. And most people are not going to deal with the issues of modern scholarship. And we have a lot of criticisms against Adventism's understanding of the 2300 days. One is because we have the scholarly arguments, which are not really addressed. They're just kind of accepted by the denomination. Most, when I say most, probably nearly almost everybody who's a Seventh-day Adventist does not understand the scholarly arguments that are made to support the start of the 2300 days in 457. Often we're told in an evangelistic series that it's an unquestioned date, that 457 BC for the 7th year of Artaxerxes is the accepted date, which it is not. 458 BC is. So we're 1 year off from what most Christians would think. Now, you will run into Christians online who accept 457 BC. They're not scholars generally. They're just people who searched online and found 457 BC, maybe read some Adventist view of the 70 weeks and accepted it, even if they're not Adventists. Part of the problem there is that even though they've accepted 457 BC, they don't really know the reasons for it. They just have accepted it. Adventists are the most represented group of Christians on the internet, have been for a long time. And one is because we do our own stuff, where most churches that are our size would just depend upon the denomination's websites. Most Adventists have some kind of mission to give the gospel to others. And we have lots of different flavors of Adventism doing that as well, so different groups. So they pattern their arguments around those of the Protestant scholarship, setting aside the simplicity of Miller's methods and his appeal to biblical authority. If one was to read the scholarly articles that attempt to give support for 457 BC as being Artaxerxes' 7th year, we find only sparse biblical evidence. Now, there is a bit, but it's sparse. There isn't a lot, since almost all scholarship recognizes that Artaxerxes' 7th year began in the spring of 458 and ended in the spring of 457. So we're going to address this as we go through, and we'll illustrate it as being Artaxerxes' 7th year. So the 7th year, according to scholarship, because this actually was his 7th year. His 7th year, according to Artaxerxes, would have begun in the spring of 458, and it would have ended in the spring of 457. Most Adventists who even accept the 2300 days and the 70 weeks do not know this, and they would think that that's some kind of error. But it's just a fact. Artaxerxes counted the 7th year of his reign from the spring of 458 to the spring of 457. And that's what all of the ancient documents show, any of the records. You just can't dispute it. That's the period of time in which Artaxerxes recognized as his 7th year. Since almost all scholarship recognizes that Artaxerxes' 7th year began in the spring of 458 and ended in the spring of 457, our reasons for accepting some other dating for his 7th year must be founded on solid biblical reasoning. The scholarly reasoning used by Seventh-day Adventists might appeal to those who have a vested interest in 1844, but it is unconvincing to those seeking objective truth. That is, if you got a vested interest in, as a Seventh-day Adventist in 1844, then you might accept those arguments, but other people aren't going to accept those arguments if they actually look at them. There's not really a reason to. It would be like, well, maybe you have a point, but all the evidence is that Artaxerxes' 7th year and Ezra's journey, as we're going to see, would have been in 458 if you're accepting the arguments of modern scholarship. So we have two lines of reasoning, and these are the way that Adventists try to nail down 457 as being Artaxerxes' 7th year. The first one they use is a biblical argument, and it considers the fact that the chronology of Nehemiah indicates that he counted the years of Artaxerxes' reign fall to fall. Basically, this is the only thing they have from the Bible that they can use to try to support the idea that the Jews counted the reigns of the Artaxerxes differently. So we're going to look at these verses. This is Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, and Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. It says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, and it came to pass in the month Kislev, the 9th month, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan in the palace. So the 9th month, Kislev, is generally in December, and Nehemiah is in Persia. He's Artaxerxes' cupbearer. And it says it came to pass in the month Nisan. So the month Nisan follows the 9th month in that it's the next year on the biblical calendar, and it is the next year on the Babylonian calendar. The Babylonian calendar, just like the biblical calendar, would have the year begin in the spring. So if you read Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, there at a time it's raining, it's the rainy season, it's in December, and then when you read in Nehemiah chapter 2, which follows it, and it came to pass in the month Nisan, which is now the first month, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king. So it's in the same year, the 20th year. So this would indicate that Nehemiah at least, is counting Artaxerxes' reign differently than Artaxerxes. Now, of course, in the scholarly world, they would have different types of arguments. Some might argue that they're actually, the chapters are in the wrong order. Some would argue that it's a scribal error, that it should have said in the 21st year of Artaxerxes the king. Since they don't always accept that the Bible is accurate when it was copied, that somehow an error crept in. Of course, this would be a very odd error to creep in and not somebody correct. You'd think people would notice. And so when you have Nehemiah 1 verse 1 and Nehemiah 2 verse 1, this is the only biblical argument that is used by scholarship to support a fall-to-fall count of Nehemiah's reign. Now, we're going to look at the next line of argument. So the second line of reasoning comes from an analysis of the Elephantine papyri. So I'm sure most of us have not looked at this. This is a very technical area of study. Elephantine is an island in Egypt where there were many Jews, and it was during the time of Artaxerxes and even earlier. So we have papyrus through a lot of this area at the time of Artaxerxes, Darius, and even kings after Artaxerxes, because there are kings after Artaxerxes, Darius II, and so forth. So we have these papyrus, which are documents. They're normally contracts that are dated. And the interesting thing about them is that they have two different dates. They're what we call double dated documents. Now, the one date would be the Egyptian date, because since it's in Egypt, you're going to have the Egyptian date on it. And the Egyptian calendar is a fixed calendar. That is, if we have an Egyptian date, we can easily tell when that date was on our calendar. Easy to tell. It's not a difficulty as long as it's well preserved and we can read everything about it. We also have another date on it, and scholars are in a disagreement about what that date is, because it could either be the Babylonian calendar, or it could be a type of biblical calendar of some sort, because it will use a reference that is biblical dates. So it would say, the month of Nisan, and whichever day it was in Nisan. So with these double dated documents, it really helps us to nail down, again, it's just a confirmation that the Egyptian calendar is correct, because it's a fixed calendar. We know that if that Egyptian date falls on a certain year on a biblical date, we've eliminated any place that we can put that calendar. So when we have a document that's dated, let's say in the 24th year of Artaxerxes, and it'll give the Egyptian date, and then it gives the biblical date, we know exactly what day that is. It might be a day off, but it's going to be pretty precise. So that problem there, or it's not a problem, it's actually an advantage having these Elephantine papyri, but the problem is that most of us aren't going to understand the arguments regarding these papyri. Now, so there's one particular or two particular documents that Adventists use, and these are called the Kraline, from the Kraline collection, and it appears that one of these documents is using a fall-to-fall reckoning, and there's still a great deal of dispute about it. It's a very technical argument, and so I don't think I would ever try to use this argument in a lecture. I mean, I've researched it myself, and I've touched on it. But it says here, the point is that the arguments are technical and not biblical arguments. They require highly specialized training and remove the means to determine the truth from the common man to experts who may or may not agree. In fact, it is almost solely Adventist scholars who interpret these documents to support a 457 BC date for the journey of Ezra from Babylon to Jerusalem in Artaxerxes' 7th year. So we have this argument outside the Bible, and it's a very technical argument, and only Adventist scholars, for the most part, accept it as supporting our understanding of 457 BC. It tends to be the one that we lean on the most in the scholarly world, though the one in Nehemiah is a good argument, showing that at least Nehemiah appears to have counted the reign of Artaxerxes fall to fall. But the problem is we don't have a lot of other biblical arguments. And so mostly what we get is just bombast when it comes to Adventists trying to support this. Now, the real problem is, if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, let's say, when I became an Adventist in the 80s, there wasn't the internet. It was hard to get access to this information. And when the church told us, 457 BC is an accepted date for Artaxerxes' decree, we just accepted it. But as time went on, I continued reading. I read Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults, so I understood to some degree that there was this dispute. And so I began researching it back in the 80s and through the 90s and since then. And I never really found a good argument until I found the 2520. So the 2520, it opened up so many different things. One is it opened up the chronology of the kings of Judah, and the chronology of the Babylonian captivity, and the chronology of the 3 decrees. And then I could have confidence to place Artaxerxes' decree in 457 BC, based on so many biblical witnesses that every Adventist should welcome this biblical argument, because for the first time we have really solid arguments that you can present to the common person that don't require a bunch of technical knowledge. You can actually accept what modern scholarship says regarding how Artaxerxes saw his reign. You have the one verse in Nehemiah, but you now have a whole bunch of prophetic structure and language and symbols that we can use to confirm 457 BC. And that's what we're going to do. We're trying to answer this question for Seventh-day Adventists who are struggling with the acceptance of the 2300 days. And especially as we progress through this history, the church itself is going to renounce the 2300 days and the 70 weeks as understood by the Adventist pioneers. They've already done that. Many Adventist pastors and scholars, educators, do not accept the 2300 days. They look at it as a mistake of the Millerites, but something that God used for a revival. They do the same thing, of course, with Revelation 9 and Josiah Litch's prophecy, and the 70 weeks themselves, they take as more symbolic than literal. So they're not even concerned about what year Jesus died. Many of them just would accept it could be 30 AD, it could have been 33, we don't know, it could have been 31. They say most likely it's not 31 AD. So this is a problem that exists that most Adventists are not aware of. And once they become aware of it as we go through this crisis, the only source that we have to really support Adventism is the truths that God has revealed through this movement and the truths that we have in the Bible. So if we're going to find support for the prophetic periods, it must come from the Bible itself. It is a mistake to use the methods of apostate Protestantism. History shows that it only leads to apostasy. If we are to find support for the prophecies upon which Adventism is founded, we must use the methods of study that were used by those who first established these prophecies. The solution lies in a solid understanding of Millerite history. There is a special light that shines on our history. It is no less than the light of the midnight cry. And this quote from Spirit of Prophecy, many of us are familiar with. After these 7 thunders uttered their voices, the injunction comes to John as to Daniel in regard to the little book. Seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered. These relate to future events, which will be disclosed, unsealed, in their order. Daniel shall stand in his lot at the end of the days. John sees the little book. Got a lot of footnotes here. Little book unsealed. Then Daniel's prophecies have their proper place in the first, second, and third angels' messages to be given to the world. The unsealing of the little book was the message in relation to time. We know the book of Daniel and Revelation are one. One's a prophecy, one's a revelation. One's a book sealed, the other a book opened. John heard the mysteries which the thunders uttered, but he was commanded not to write them. The special light given to John, which was expressed in the seven thunders, was a delineation, that means to set upon a line, of events which would transpire or unfold under the first and second angels' messages. It was not best for the people to know these things, for their faith must necessarily be tested. So the Millerites themselves could not know these things because their faith was being tested. In the order of God, most wonderful and advanced truths would be proclaimed. The first and second angels' messages were to be proclaimed, but no further light was to be revealed before these messages had done their specific work. So she's going back, of course, to Millerite history, and this is light that would transpire under the first and second angels' messages from 1840 to 1844. And once these messages did their work, then there was going to be light that would be revealed. And of course, we know that there was the sanctuary, a truths, and the investigative judgment, which was part of that truth that was revealed. This time, which the angel declares with a solemn oath, is not the end of this world's history, neither of probationary time, but of prophetic time, which should precede the advent of our Lord. That is, the people will not have another message upon definite time. After this period of time, reaching from 1842 to 1844, there can be no definite tracing of the prophetic time. The longest reckoning reaches to the autumn of 1844. The angel's position, with one foot on the sea and the other on the land, signifies the wide extent of the proclamation of the message. It will cross the broad waters and be proclaimed in other countries, even to all the world. The comprehension of truth, the glad reception of the message, is represented in the eating of the little book. The truth in regard to the time of the advent of our Lord was a precious message to our souls. So what we see here is that this definitely relates to Millerite history, but we can also see that it applies to the end of the world. So the first, as she talks about the first and second and third angels' messages, are what's involved. And we know that the third angel's message arrived on October 22nd, 1844. And so we're under the proclamation of the third angel's message. Go back here. So there's criticism of Adventist methods of study. So I've spent a lot of years studying arguments against Adventism. But there are people within Adventism who have arguments who've tried to solve the problem. Now, there's one guy called Juarez Rodrigues de Oliveira. He's a Brazilian Adventist scholar who expresses support for 457 and 1844. So he's one of the scholars who is trying to use arguments to support 1844 and 457 BC. And he's critical of Adventist scholarship that overstates the support for these dates and seeks to find other arguments for them. So he's basically doing the same thing that I've always been trying to do. So we find a weakness to his approach as well. So his approach still is kind of a scholarly approach, and he makes a lot of assumptions. So we recognize, though, that he assesses these problems correctly. So let's look at what the problems are. So there's three main problems that relate to the beginning of the prophetic periods in 457. So he says there's impossibility of proving conclusively the date 457 BC as the year for Ezra's trip. And we're going to look at these problems in detail. So we need to note them. Now, the other problem is involved in incorrectly placing the 10th day of the 7th month in 457 BC in September and not October as required. And we're going to come back to this because for those of you who did the homework assignment, you'll start to see this problem as well. What is the first day of the first month in 457 BC? His argument that it is April 26th, not March 27th. And he also, the lack of a specific Julian date for the beginning of the 2300 days and the 70 weeks. So within Adventism, we have an argument that it's in the fall of 457 BC that the 2300 days commence. We'll say that the prophetic periods, in talking about the 70 weeks and the 2300 days as the only prophetic periods, that they begin in 457 BC. But we're quite unclear about when they begin. So we might say something like they went into effect in the fall of 457 BC. It's not clear what that would mean. So there's lots of different views, but nobody says we know the exact date when the 10th day of the 7th month was. They're not sure about, but also where in the year do we start the 2300 days? Now, part of that is a heritage that was sort of brought down from Miller initially, because Miller, even though he was sure about the 70 weeks, the 2300 days he seemed to be less certain about. And we've sort of revived that after the 7th month movement that placed the end of the 2300 days on October 27, 1844, or October 22nd, 1844. We never really tried to nail down the start of the 2300 days other than in a general sense. And we have some of Ellen White's statements that people read into them what she's saying, and but she's very clear, but they don't fully understand the issues, so they don't really understand her statements. So we're going to address that problem, obviously in more detail as we go on. Now, what we will note now is that Artaxerxes' 7th year, according to the Egyptian calendar, was from December 7th, 459 to December 15th, 458 BC. So, so the Egyptians did count Artaxerxes' reign earlier than the, so this is a problem, which I'm not going to get into the technical points of, because the Egyptian year in 459 started in December. Now, Artaxerxes counted his reign in the following spring, and Seventh-day Adventists contend that his actual reign, according to Nehemiah and according to the prophecy, began in the fall. And I have some good arguments of why he would count in the fall that people have probably never thought of, but we'll deal with those later as well. Now, so the Persian calendar or the Babylonian calendar, they counted it from April 8th, 458 BC, and the last day would have been March 26, 457 BC. For Seventh-day Adventists, we must consider Artaxerxes' 7th year as being reckoned from October 2nd, 458 B to October 20, 457 BC. So you can see that we have these staggered lines. We have the Egyptian calendar that would start his 7th year in December. We have the Persian or Babylonian calendar that's going to start his 7th year in the following spring. And then we have the Seventh-day Adventist understanding that's going to reckon his 7th year from the following fall. So about 6 months later than Artaxerxes would have considered to count it himself. And so his 7th year would start in the fall of 458 and end in the fall of 457. And we're going to see how these different views are sort of mixed up for Seventh-day Adventists. So Oliveira shows that many of the statements by Adventist scholars, Horn, Hassel, Olson, and all those others, are overstated. And this is true. They overstate the evidence, especially when writing to Seventh-day Adventists. So some of them have apologized for their overstatements and said, yes, I was making an overstatement. And I'm not going to look at all those overstatements because there's tons of them. I do have a few, I think, in the footnotes. So we agree with Oliveira that the 10th day of the 7th month in 457 is in 457. In 457 is in October, specifically October 29th. His arguments to place the date as the commencement of the 70 weeks and the 2300 days fall short. We believe that it is an understanding of the dates in Ezra 7 to 10, which place the 10th day of the 7th month in the center of the chiasm as a solid biblical argument. So one of his arguments, that it took me a while reading his book. I don't think it's a well-written book. It's sort of a hodgepodge of information. Parts of it are well-written, but parts of it are just a bunch of added material. It seemed a little bit lazy on his part, putting the book together. Maybe he ran out of time. But it's not really a criticism of his arguments. It's just that it's hard to follow reading his book. And of course, he's not an English speaker. He's Portuguese in his language. So, but his book, which I could probably send it to people if they want to look at it, but it's dealing with the chronology. I can't remember the title of it. The chronology of 1844. But he has a lot of errors. So one of the things that's interesting is he professes to accept Ellen White, but he actually contradicts several Ellen White's statements that are very clear statements, and uses slippery language to try to get around it. And I'm never happy when people do that. If you have a problem, you have to admit, this is a problem, I don't know how to explain it, and maybe an answer will come later. But he uses some slippery language, and I've had email discussions with him. He never will discuss any of the things. He will just say, read my books, and all the papers he sent me. So it's not really very helpful into trying to see his problem. But his main issue is he has this idea of when the crucifixion is that is different than the way that we would understand it. He has Jesus crucified on the 15th day of the first month, not the 14th day of the first month. So he accepts the modern Jewish idea of how the Passover is done to some degree. It's a little bit confusing, and he uses a lot of astronomy, the programs dealing when the sighting of the first visible crescent is. And so he makes a lot of assumptions, which I used to have, that I eventually abandoned, that I found that those assumptions did not work. So I'm not going to go into all of his arguments, but the problem is it still falls short. It's not very convincing to other scholars, and very few Adventists would be able to enter into those arguments because they're scholarly arguments. They're not really biblical arguments. I mean, he makes an attempt to use some evidences from the Bible, but he really falls short of that. And then he also contradicts the spirit of prophecy. So that creates a problem for Adventists who want to believe that the Adventist movement is led by God and that Ellen White is led by God. So just giving lip service that you support Ellen White when you actually take some of her statements as false isn't really very helpful. So we're going to look at the end of the 2300 days first before we get back to the beginning. And the beginning is in the book of Ezra. So while after the first disappointment of April 19th, 1844, the Millerites found themselves in the tarrying time with all their hopes seemingly dashed, the key to their disappointment lay in the understanding of the biblical calendar. So here's what they say regarding after their disappointment. As our time has thus passed, the civil year having terminated last October, and the ecclesiastical with the new moon in April, this being on the evening of the 18th, with my brackets there, we are now prepared to tell the world what we shall do, a question which has often been asked. We intend to hold fast the integrity of our faith without wavering, and not cast away our confidence, which hath great recompense of reward. We intend to continue to comfort one another with the words of the coming of Christ, who will come and will not tarry. We shall continue to believe God's word in its literal acceptation or meaning, for not one jot or tittle of all that was written therein will fail. So he brings up a point which I'm going to just make sure you understand this. And we can, it's a sort of backtracking over what we were talking about. So let's take this as the year 457 BC. And this is the year 456. And this is the year 458. And then we also have the same thing in 1844. We have 1844. We have 1843. And we can put it here, 1845. We probably don't need it. Now this is, of course, these are the years on our calendar here. This is a Julian calendar. This is a Gregorian. They're a number of days off from the start, but they're basically the same. And we saw that in 457 BC, that Artaxerxes would have counted his first year, spring to spring, and so also his seventh year, spring to spring. And his seventh year would have been from the spring of 458 to the spring of 457. And then this would have been his eighth year. Now we know that even for the Egyptians, they would have started his seventh year here, much more close to the beginning of our 458th year. So it would have actually been in 459 in December. But as Seventh-day Adventists, we have accepted the view, which is the correct one, we just haven't been able to show it, that the seventh year of Artaxerxes, according to Ezra and Nehemiah, is going from the fall of 458 to the fall of 457. And so we have this eighth year over here. So we see the same thing in 1844, and so they recognize it a spring and a fall calendar. So they're here in 1844, and they recognize, I probably could have put it over here. I'm going to do this here so I have more room. So if you're going to look at the spring to spring year, this is the one that Miller looked at. He would have looked at this as the Jewish year 1843. So this is in the spring to spring. And he didn't actually figure this out until December of 1842, or at least express it. For the first time, it was in December of 1842 that he first said that the Jewish year, that the year 1843, which he had chosen for the termination of the 2300 days and the 2520, was not going to be our year 1843. It was actually going to be the ecclesiastical year, which goes from the spring. This ecclesiastical means the religious year, because this is where they're going to have their Passovers and their Days of Atonements and so forth. And he actually at one point even thought that maybe on the 10th day of the 7th month in 1843 on the Jewish calendar that the 2300 days would end. So this is when they're just figuring out that actually there's a 0 year. We don't have all the documentation to know how their thinking evolved. We just have some of it. But over here, this article that I read, this quote, where it says their expectations had wholly passed in the spring. So the new moon in April, so this would have gone on sunset on April 9th, 18th, that they experienced the disappointment. They experienced the end of the Jewish year, 1843, the Jewish ecclesiastical year. But he also mentions the civil year and that it ended the preceding fall. So he knows that back here, and this is where Miller was looking for the 10th day of the 7th month, this would have been at the end of the civil year, 1843. So we have these two different years of the biblical sort, one spring to spring and one's fall to fall, but we also have our year. And this has created a lot of problems for people trying to understand this, because it takes a little bit of thinking, mostly drawing, that helps a lot. But there's this fuzziness about what actually happens here for most Seventh-day Adventists. And even here, when we deal with this history, the vast majority of Adventism, even scholarship, gets it wrong about what actually happened here, how the prophetic periods were actually reckoned, and how the changes came about to get to the date that they ultimately wanted to get to, which was the fall of 1844, rather than the spring for the end of the prophetic periods. So this is fall to fall, this would have been the Jewish year 1844. And so this is the year that we have to deal with. Now, there's some confusions because most Adventists would just think that we actually moved this year 1843 over to here. But we didn't. We actually had to recognize that the Jewish year 1843 ended and that this was a new Jewish year 1844 that began here. There's the 7th month. So it's confusing. I've talked to people within this movement who were really unclear about this because they would just think that the 1843 is followed, you know, the spring to spring one is followed by a spring to spring year 1843. And this was not even really clear to the Millerites necessarily either. When you read their writings, they get confused about this point. They get confused about other points, just like we would, because they were human and they often didn't have clear thinking. They were fuzzy in their thinking. So I hope this is helpful so far as people look at this. Now, I'm going to go back to the notes again. We're going to really try to narrow this down and really get a grasp on what's being talked about. And so we all know about Samuel Snow. It was in the tarrying time that Samuel Snow, of course, through his personal diligent Bible study, came to recognize that the 2520 years must end in the fall of 457 rather than in the spring. And just as Miller first saw the 2520 years ending in 1843, prior to his discovering the 2300 days, Snow first saw the end of the prophetic periods using the 2520. So his first argument, and well, I shouldn't say it's his first, because he also used the 6,000 years. But his first prophetic period argument is the 2520. And it seems to him, and I don't think his arguments are really good. They might be correct, but they're not really good and convincing arguments, but they're at least part of what he used. He first expressed this in a letter sent to the editor of the Midnight Cry, dated February 16, 1844, and published on the 22nd. And this letter was again republished in the Signs of the Times on April 3rd, 1844 by Himes. Snow's letter, though published, was pretty much ignored and came with a disclaimer. So they said, we accept this letter from Brother Snow. We're going to publish it because he wants us to publish it, but we don't agree with his conclusions because we don't see any of the prophetic periods going beyond the spring of 1844. But of course, as time unfolded and that time passed, then people became much more interested in studying Snow's arguments. And so as they would continue to be unfolded, they culminated in the Midnight Cry on August 15th, 1844 at the Exeter camp meeting. So one of the things I say here is that this light unfolded as they approached the event, which is an important point. And the light of the Midnight Cry is still shining and is still unfolding, even in regards to the commencement of the 2300 days. For one, for no one's intent, the message was empowered exactly 2300 years to the day from when Ezra arrived at Jerusalem. So nobody intended this to happen. It was empowered exactly 2300 years to the day from when Ezra arrived at Jerusalem, since the first day of the first month in 1844 was April 19th. This means that the first day of the 5th month was August 15th, the day that Snow presented his complete argument to the congregation at Exeter. He had presented it the evening before, but it was presented on the 15th, the complete argument. This light did not begin to be recognized until the summer of 2013. We further came to understand that Snow's first presentation of the Midnight Cry, which was given on July 21st at the Boston Tabernacle, was exactly midnight. This he partly understood. So this follows now his part of his presentation that he made at the Boston Tabernacle on the Sunday morning service on July 21st, 1844. And I've read this a number of times in all different contexts because I like the way it's written. So I'm going to read it again. Brother Snow thus questioned them, where are we in our Advent experience? Answer from the audience, in the tarrying time. Question, how long was the vision to tarry? The answer from the audience was until midnight. Question, what is a day in prophecy? A year. What then would a night be? 6 months. What then would midnight be? 3 months. How long have we been in the tarrying time? The answer is just 3 months. He said, then it is just the midnight now, and I'm here with the midnight cry. In a few sentences, he explained that it was the fall of 457 that the decree went forth, and so they were short 6 months in their reckoning, showing them that the 2300 days would terminate October 22nd, 1844, instead of the spring as they had previously supposed. Then, in a strong voice, he said, behold, the bridegroom cometh on the 10th day of the 7th month, October 22, 1844. Go ye out to meet him. Now, this quote is from Jan Loughborough, and he was not there personally, but he took this from, I believe, Joseph Bates and maybe James White recollection of some of these events. But you can see there's a problem. So let's go back and examine this problem here. So the problem comes, one of the problems is Snow's argument is faulty. So, but also where this quote is placed. So if we put on a line the 10th day of the 7th month, and the first day of the first month, we know that the center of this is the 5th day of the 4th month. This is Ezekiel's first vision on the 5th day of the 4th month. And this is a period, if you count ordinally, of 187 days. And this is Boston. And then 25 days later, we're going to have Exeter. And of course, we know the dates here are April 19th, July 21st. This is the first day of the 5th month. And this is August 15th. And this is October 22, all in 1844. And so here at Boston is where this presentation was given. And you can see, if you go from the first day of the first month to the 5th day of the 4th month, this is a period, the first month, the 2nd month, the 3rd month, and just 5 days into the 4th month. So it's 3 months and 4 days. And if we go from here, you can see again, you go from the beginning of July to August, September, and then into, or not the beginning, the end of July, so the beginning of the 4th month. But you would come here, and this would then be a period of about 3 months. And it looks like 1 day, but of course there's, months here that have 31 where there isn't as many here. But this is the center. Now on the biblical calendar, it would be easier to count this out. You can sort of see that if you take, because the 1 you would have to count as a 0, but you can see this is 3 months to the 5th day and 3 months to the 10th day. So you can see that it's very proportional. Now Loughborough places this quote here at Exeter. He doesn't appear to know about the Boston event. So this is the Boston Tabernacle, holds about 5,000 people. At the Exeter camp meeting, they had a tent that held 5,000 people. So, maybe this is almost like feeding the 5,000. Anyway, so when you look at Loughborough's placing it here, it's pretty obvious that this is not 3 months from April 19th to August 15th. And this would not be then 3 months from here to here. You would have basically a period of 2 months and a week or so. So obviously he could not have made the statement here that he's midway. And Ellen White says that it was midway that the midnight cry was given in the very language of the parable of the 10 virgins. Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him. So this is where this is placed. And it took us a long time to dig this out. It wasn't something that was on the surface that we've always known. It wasn't until 2013 that we came to understand the first day of the 5th month as being Exeter. And then a couple of years later, that we then came to the understanding of midnight or midway being exactly halfway between the first day of the 1st month and the 10th day of the 7th month, and that this was in Boston. So it took us putting together a number of quotes to actually nail this down. Even nailing this down took a little while. We were a little fuzzy about exactly when the first day of the 5th month was. So it wasn't really until 2014 that we got this actually nailed down. In 2013, we started to study it. And then wasn't until 2015, 2016 that this became clearer. But these dates become really, really important. And there's some structures that are in here that are important. Obviously, the first structure there is a prophetic mirror. So this being the midpoint or midway, being exactly halfway between these two events was very significant. We also have some symbols here that we're going to look at later, 5th day of the 4th month, 10th day of the 7th month. Most of us would understand this, not necessarily recognize it as a symbol. But also these waymarks, which we came to in 2016, once we had really nailed them down, we had them as 9/11, midnight, the midnight cry, and the Sunday law on our line. And we're still using these. But this line of waymarks that we had in 2016 that all occurred in Millerite history, it's interesting when we add these numbers together, 11, 54, 15, and 107, that they equal 187, which is the period of time here. We also know that Samuel Snow's letters exist in here, and that he has a letter, which I'm just kind of jumping ahead, July 18th. That's 3 days before July 21st. And July 18th is also a symbol of the 18th day of the 7th month, or 187. So there's a bunch of symbols in here that, when I wrote this paper, I hadn't fully comprehended. Some of them I have, especially these ones here, hadn't added up these numbers till recently. So we can then, and this is part of the argument that I use, that I'm trying to convey to people if I'm sharing this with them. And I can see all of you here watching this or participating right now understand these things to a large degree. But other people watching the videos online on YouTube, they may not be as familiar with these ideas. But what I really want to establish when I'm sharing this with someone is that these are things that we can establish within Adventist history, and yet there's a symbolic representation of these numbers that establishes that they're true. That is, they affirm what we already understand as Seventh-day Adventists. And this is what we're going to look at as we move to the beginning of the prophetic periods in 457 BC. We're going to see a lot of this structure is in 1844 as well, that ties these two histories together in a ways that's mathematically impossible to have occurred by chance. And these arguments would be very convincing. When Ellen White says that people will be won to the truth, not so much by argument, but by the unction of the Holy Spirit. And I've thought about this a little bit. When we think about arguments are these very technical, scholarly arguments. These are things that are sort of opinions. Scholarly opinions are offered. You can't prove anything in scholarship because they use sort of a scientific method where you're always in doubt about things. And there's some ways in which that's true. You have to be uncertain about yourself and know that you as a person are limited in your knowledge and your understanding. But the Holy Spirit can teach us things. And that knowledge comes through a fear of the Lord. For the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And he that walks in the light will also be given further light. If you want to know the truth, you have to obey Christ. So that there's a different way that knowledge is acquired when you're a Christian than when you're a worldly. But we often apply the worldling sort of system of understanding what is truth, or epistemology, to the Bible. which of course is wrong. Doesn't mean the Bible isn't affirmed by facts and reality. It obviously has to be because it's true. But it's just that we can look at other types of arguments that scientists wouldn't look at, and that is the coincidences of numbers, for instance, or these symbols. They wouldn't be understood by scientists because they exclude God automatically in their assumptions. And once you exclude God automatically, then any of these things would be seen as mysticism. And I can tell you one thing I'm not is a mystic. Not interested in mysticism at all. Not interested in any kind of magic. I'm only interested in objective things. But the fact that mathematics is an objective thing is, for me, very compelling. When I can look at the odds that a certain dates added together are going to create a number that represents the whole period of the time of the dates, or a date that's following it, or symbolizes another way these dates, I can actually measure that objectively. And I can say, well, that is highly unlikely. And if I have a whole series of these things that are highly unlikely, and they're all part of a unit or a structure, I can then add that probability to that whole structure. What's the probability that this structure exists with these characteristics? And then I can say, well, the chances that that occurred randomly are 0. And just like if I found a watch in the sand, a Swiss watch, and it's got the maker's name maybe engraved in it, it's keeping perfect time, I wouldn't say that that watch came about by chance. It'd be a fool who would say that it did. We would know it has a designer. And what we are seeing in these wheels within wheels as we go through and we study all this history is we see that it's design. It's not chance. And that type of argument is more the unction of the Holy Spirit. When you can show someone these arguments, a lot of those technical arguments, these other types of arguments, can easily be set aside because the Holy Spirit can impress the heart, and the person can recognize this is something that is divine. It is a miracle. And that is the Holy Spirit speaking to the person. So we don't have to have all these arguments. We're not going to win them over by showing them all the arguments. There will be something that we can show them, though, that will catch their desire to know the truth. And when that happens, they can then examine the evidence for themselves. But it's the unction of the Holy Spirit that's needed, the power of the Holy Spirit to give that desire and open up that person's mind so that they can see these miracles. Somebody whose mind is closed, who's rejected the Holy Spirit, no amount of arguments are ever going to convince them. So we're going to now deal with Daniel 9 and try to understand some of the problems that I had as a Seventh-day Adventist in trying to comprehend these things, some of the misunderstandings I had. So I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. And so in Daniel 9:25, we have this statement, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So I've preached this many times in sermons, that the temple and Jerusalem, all these things were all completed under Artaxerxes' decree. The way that most Adventists understand the 3 decrees is that there's these 3 different decrees, and we need to choose which one is going to be used to start the 70 weeks, that's going to end with Jesus being crucified in the midst of the week, and also to start the 2300 days, the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, I have seen so many people present, because I've done it myself, that's why I did it, is that in 457 BC, Artaxerxes' decree began, and then by 408, so 49 years later, the first 7 weeks, that's when it was all completed. And I might have had some sketchy idea that Cyrus had a decree and the people went back, and it has something to do with the temple, but nothing really happened there. For some reason, I hadn't really, even though I'd read Prophets and Kings, it never really clicked in, because I just had this idea in my mind already, So anything that really didn't fit, I didn't understand. And I've seen many Adventists present this recently as well. I've discussed with people on Facebook where they have the temple is built 408 BC, 49 years after 457 BC. And I'm like, you realize that the temple was built in 515 BC. We've already seen that. It was dedicated on March 12, 515 BC, which was on the biblical calendar, the inversion of that, the third day of the 12th month instead of the 12th day of the third month. So we know when the temple was built. We know that there's some things that happened under Artaxerxes' decree that had to do with the temple. But the real issue was the building of the city. And when I use the word building, it's not even really about the structure, though there's going to be, under Nehemiah's decree, the street and the walls are going to be built. So it's not even under Artaxerxes' decree. And that's in 444. That there is actually 3 steps that are mentioned in this verse. So we're going to look at this. I'm going to draw this up for you. So we'll leave this up here, and I'm going to draw this below. Now, we of course have Cyrus' decree over here, and we have Darius over here. And we know under Darius' decree, there was, the decree is given in 516. We're going to say, this is 530, 37, 36, and this is 516, 15, just to kind of cover the period of time under which these things occurred. And then we're going to have Artaxerxes' decree here in 457. Well, really, it's going to be here in 457. So up here we have 1844. So in 457 BC, and we're going to address some of these details that we talked about, some of the problems, but the first thing we're going to see is that this decree, or this conditions that are needed to fulfill the specifications of the prophecy, Ellen White says that there's 3 decrees that are needed. She says Cyrus's decree in commencing, Darius's in affirming, and Artaxerxes in, she doesn't use the word completing. I can't remember the words used. I always like commencing, confirming, and completing, but she uses different words than that. I think she uses completing here and some other word there. But anyway, you have these 3 decrees. So you still have this 457. You have Artaxerxes' decree in 457. But this decree, the conditions, what the prophecy is talking about, is actually not these 3 decrees per se, though they're all needed, because you have to have these events happen. They're ending the Babylonian captivity. But it's this decree itself where it said, the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. So when we think about that, we just think of it, the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. It's just one event. We just blurt it all out. But that's not really what's being said. The going forth of the commandment. Now that word restore is translated in the King James. The Hebrew word is shuv. Now shuv means return. Now the English word restore also means restore. If you steal something from somebody and you give it back to him, you restored it. You returned it. Or even if you restore something that's been damaged, which is kind of how we think of fixing something up, you're returning it to the condition it was before. We even have the word repair, and even that word means the same as return. So if I'm going to repair to my room, well, repairing to my room has nothing to do with fixing it up. It just means to return to my room. But yet we've kind of changed all these 2 words, restore and repair. We've used them in another sense, but not in the sense in which the King James translator was using it. Now there is the Bishop's Bible, which precedes the King James by a number of years. And in the Bishop's Bible, the way that this is translated is the going forth of the commandment and the return of the people to build. And this is actually more what this is talking about. So when we look at this, we're going to see that in this year 457 BC, we're going to have 3 events that are being marked. The first one is the going forth of the commandment. The second is going to be the return. So King James says restore, but we'll see the return of the people. And then the final one is to build. So you have these 3 different events. It's actually a 3-step process that's going to be fulfilled in this history. Now, I sum this all up in here in the notes in a very quick way, and we're going to work our way through it step by step. So I say, to understand this more fully, we propose that the verse is fulfilled in 3 steps. As noted earlier, Miller understood that the going forth of the commandment occurred when Ezra left Babylon on the first day of the first month. And I probably could correct that because I later understood that it was on the 12th day of the first month that Miller understood the going forth of the commandment to occur, not on the first day of the first month. So I hadn't understood that until later. We have seen that the first day of the first month marks the first disappointment in 1844. The second step occurred when Ezra arrived in Jerusalem on the first day of the 5th month in 457 BC. The Hebrew word that is translated in the King James as restore means return, so I explained that already. This is marked in 1844 with the empowerment of the midnight cry at Exeter. The third step is the building of Jerusalem. Can we also mark this in 457 BC? When Ezra arrives in Jerusalem on a Thursday, he waits for 3 days before bringing the gold to the temple on the first day of the week. The next date that is given in Ezra is when he calls all of the people to Jerusalem for confession, giving them 3 days to arrive. The 3 days ends on the 20th day of the 9th month. Nothing is specifically marked between these 2 dates. It is our contention that this is a chiasm or prophetic mirror. The date that lies exactly in the middle of the first day of the 5th month and the 20th day of the 9th month is the 10th day of the 7th month. So that's a lot of information in a very short period of time. So let's take a look at this. So I have the verses, and we're going to look at them. So I'm going to switch over to my Bible and look at these verses. The verses that we have are in Ezra 8, verse 32 to 33, and Ezra 10, verse 7 to 9. So we'll first go to Ezra 8. And in Ezra 8, there's a lot in Ezra 8, because this is when they return. It tells the whole story of, so I'm going to kind of sum it up, but you can read that yourself. So they get, on the first day of the first month, Ezra leaves Babylon. And then he arrives at the river Ahava. And at the river Ahava, he's meeting a bunch of other people that all came to gather there. And they have priests, but no Levites. And he wants there to be Levites. So he divides the gold and the silver to some of the priests. And while he's doing that, he sends other people away to go gather some Levites and to come back. And they also have a 3-day fast. So they fast for 3 days while they wait at the river Ahava for the Levites to come back. When they come back, they leave. And they leave on the 12th day of the first month. And this is why Miller chose the 12th day of the first month for the start of the 70 weeks, because he also believed in his reading of the New Testament. He says there's 3 places, there's only 2, where it talks about 2 days before the Passover that that Judas betrays Christ, and he assumes then, contrary to all the other evidence in the scriptures, plain evidence actually, that Jesus was crucified on the 12th day of the first month in 33 AD. So he has the 70 weeks and on the 12th day of the first month in 33 AD. Now, so this story of the river Ahava comes into play. So we'll start at verse 31. So we departed from the river Ahava on the 12th day of the first month to go unto Jerusalem, and the hand of God, our God, was upon us. And he delivered us from the hand of the enemy, and as such as lay in wait by the way. And we came to Jerusalem and abode there 3 days. Now on the 4th day was the silver and the gold and the vessels weighed in the house of God by the hand of Meremoth, the son of Uriah, the priest. And with him was Eleazar, the son of Phinehas, and with him was Jozabad, the son of Jeshua, and Noadiah, the son of Binneu. They were Levites. And it talks about the weight of the gold and all this stuff. The main point that we want to make is that we have over here, let's call this the going forth here is going to be, we have really 2 dates if you wanted to look at it. You have the first day of the first month, and you have the 12th day of the first month. So this 12th day of the first month is at the river Ahava. And both of these would be the going forth out of Babylon. So you have the going forth out of Babylon that occurs here in this period of time. And before...
Can you switch the view, please?
Thank you. I've been pretty good at this so far, but this one I made a mistake. So you're going to put 3 days here. So they leave Babylon, they come to the river Ahava, and they wait 3 days, and then on the 12th day of the first month, they're going to leave the river Ahava. And then it says that 3 days later, or after they arrive here on the first day of the 5th month, that they wait here for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, they bring the gold and silver to the temple. So we have these 3 dates explicitly mentioned, this in Ezra chapter 7, this in Ezra chapter 8, and this also in Ezra chapter 8. So this is going to be Jerusalem. And now we're going to go to chapter 10. In Ezra chapter 10, so what happens between chapter 8 and chapter 10? So Ezra gets to Jerusalem, and he spends some time setting up the administration. Now, one of the things is when you read Artaxerxes' decree in Ezra 7, we probably should go back there and read that as well. We're going to see that there's some, what is given there is not a commandment to restore or to build Jerusalem in the way that we commonly think of it. And this is one of the criticisms that people have regarding the Adventist understanding of the 70 weeks. Because if you take Artaxerxes' decree, it doesn't appear to address the issues that are the specifications of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 to 27. So when people read it, they say, well, Artaxerxes' decree doesn't really seem to fit. Cyrus's decree seems to address the issue that they imagine, which is they think it's all about the temple. But we do know under Cyrus's decree they returned. So Adventism has missed out on some really good arguments. One is if we would have understood Leviticus 26, and we would have understood the periods of 70 years and 140 years, which I show in other studies in much more detail, they would have had a good understanding for placing a chronology to the decrees. So Artaxerxes' decree, Darius' decree, and Cyrus's decree at the beginning. So we would have had some better rationale. And one is its biblical arguments. So even though we can confirm them by history, by archaeology, and they're still really biblical arguments. You don't need to know all the technical arguments because you can see how the Bible all fits together in this structure. Of course, anybody can always question the chronology. There's always different views on it. Even some people have all kinds of crazy ideas about Artaxerxes' decree. Now, it is interesting to note we often use Ussher's chronology in the Bible. We often think of that. Now, the chronology that was in the Bible in Ellen White's day, was not actually Ussher's chronology. It was a revision of Ussher's chronology. Ussher had a much different view of the 70 weeks than we do. That is, Ussher understood that Artaxerxes' seventh year was 10 years earlier. So he didn't have it in 457, he had it in 467. So this is something that's not generally well known. And then he actually used Nehemiah's decree, the one for the building of the streets and walls, and he had it placed in 454 BC, again 10 years earlier than the 444 BC date that's now accepted. And he used that decree to count 490 years to the time of Christ. And you see that he actually starts 3 years later than the 457 BC date, but it's Artaxerxes' second decree. And then what you have is you have 33 AD for the crucifixion, but it still is in the midst of the week, because you would have the 70th week end in 37 AD. Now, the problem with Ussher's chronology is that there's things that he didn't know. He used Ptolemy's canon. Ptolemy leaves out some of the reigns of the kings. And so people corrected Ussher for good reason. The other thing is that we have now the Elephantine Papyri, and there's one thing that we're very clear about, is that you cannot move Artaxerxes' seventh year 10 years earlier. We have documents that are double dated, Egyptian and biblical or Babylonian chronology calendar on there. And there's no way you can move those 10 years earlier. They will not line up at all with those dates. You can't have a biblical date that's going to be 10 years earlier and still match the Egyptian calendar. So that's a big problem with Ussher's chronology in that era. But that was even corrected before people had the Elephantine Papyri. We can now date all these documents very accurately. So I always found that one very attractive, that argument, you know, when I've seen it in the past. You know, what if it was the fourth decree and what if it was 10 years earlier? But when you looked at it, it just didn't fit. So we do have the 70-week prophecy, and what most Adventist scholars would say is it's just a symbolic period of time. We don't actually have to have exact dates for it, and we don't need it. That would be their argument. But once you do that, it destroys the whole foundation of prophecy. You know, October 22nd, 1844 isn't a real date. It's just people's imagination, and God used it, which doesn't seem to be the God that I worship. So, you know, we're obviously worshiping different gods there. So when we look at this here now, so let's, here, I'm going to go back here. So we have this going forth and the return. So these we can nail down, but what we don't have is the to build. We can say, well, it's in the fall. Yes, they can. They can see me. Yeah, so it's in the fall, we know, but as Oliveira says, we don't have a Julian date for the start of the 2300 days or the 70 weeks. We just have this general idea that somehow it was in the year 457. We have some statements that says it commenced in the fall. And I have to bring out another problem that I mentioned, but I didn't go through it. So one of the problems that we had with the statement that Samuel Snow made, not so much the statement he made, but Loughborough's explanation of it. It does have to do with an understanding of how Samuel Snow came to the 10th day of the 7th month as being in the fall. And it says that the decree, the going forth of the decree was in the fall. Now, Ellen White doesn't say this. The decree was not given in the fall. It did not go forth in the fall. It was given in the year 1847, 457. It was given in the year 457 prior to Ezra leaving Babylon. So it was given sometime between the beginning of 457 and before the first day of the first month. And we're going to look at that when we go into our second half of this. We're going to start looking at some of this chronology a little more precisely. So we know that Ellen White says that it was before the first day of the first month that the decree was given or issued. So it was issued obviously prior to Ezra leaving Babylon in 457. But according to Samuel Snow, he actually saw the decree was given or issued in the fall of 457, which is a real problem because that would mean that the journeys of Ezra would have had to be in the spring of 456, which would be even another year later. And so he just starts this idea that it's in the fall. And you'll see this idea still commonly accepted by Seventh-day Adventists. They'll say that it was in the 7th year of Artaxerxes that the decree was issued, and that it was issued in the fall. They don't know this history about Ezra. They don't understand anything about the first and second decree. They don't definitely break the decree down into 3 steps. It's just passed by. And so if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, and let's say the churches open up again, and you're going to a regular Adventist church, and a Sunday law is approaching, and your pastor says, we're Seventh-day Adventists, and God led in the organization of this church. He wanted us to understand the sanctuary so that we could teach people that God is going to be judged. And he gave us the Sabbath to let people know that we need to rest 1 day a week. And that day of the week doesn't really matter. You could do it on Sunday or Saturday. Those are the types of things that are going to be said. With the hellish torch of false prophecy, in meetings in the open and the air and in their churches and from our pulpits, we will hear our ministers urging upon us the necessity of observing the first day of the week. And many Adventists, the arguments that will be used are not just about which day is the Sabbath and which day isn't. It's going to be these fuzzy arguments. They're going to, of course, argue that Adventism, Ellen White's prophet, was in error. She just had the common errors of the day. She lived in a dispensation or a time when people believed the Bible literally, but yet God was still leading her. He was leading her to understand spiritual issues. All these things about the 2300 days and the investigative judgment, all these things were errors that God allowed so that he could have this church grow, but we're now setting those aside. And of course, it sounds very, very familiar to a movement that we're all familiar with. What we're going to see in Adventism is what we've already seen in this movement. People moving away from the Sabbath, from the sure word of prophecy, and from the spirit of prophecy to these modern ideas. And it will happen so suddenly that people who we thought were stalwart conservative Adventists will turn from the truth. But there will be another class of people who have been searching the scriptures, looking for light. And when they study these things, these simple things that we show them, they will have a confidence in the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, that God laid the foundation properly at the beginning and that he has been leading this church. And these are the things that are much more convincing, even than an event like we expect on July 18th, 2020. If people can spend the time searching the things that we're studying, they're amazingly impossible to have occurred by chance. They're much more a miracle than us actually predicting an event and it being fulfilled. So let's go back to the Bible here, and we're going to go to chapter 10 now. So in chapter 10, so during chapter 9, he's laying down this civil authority. Actually, let's go to chapter 7 just briefly. So in chapter 7, we all know Artaxerxes' decree, but it's the latter part of the decree that's interesting, because if you read the decree through, you'll start to realize that the issue here is the civil authority. And this starts in verse 25, Ezra 7:25. And thou, Ezra, after the wisdom of thy God that is in thine hand, set magistrates and judges, which may judge all the people that are beyond the river, all such as know the laws of thy God, and teach ye them teach ye them that know them not. And whosoever will not do the law of thy God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily upon him, whether it be unto death, so the death penalty, to banishment, to confiscation of goods, or to imprisonment. There's 4 things that are listed, and he provides materials to beautify the house in Jerusalem, and of course he provides them with gold and silver and all these other types of things that can be used as offerings in the temple. But the real body of this decree is about the civil authority. So when we go to chapter 10, Ezra has been in Babylon now for a few months. And so he arrived on the first day of the 5th month, and we're going to find that he's actually here in the 9th month. So he's actually quite a while that he's been here. Now he says, so what he finds is that the people are married to strange wives. And so in verse 3 it says, "Now therefore let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and such as are born of them, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those that tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law." So this is a legal thing that he's doing. He has the authority to do it, and they're going to provide this legally, both to sort of the civil law, so to speak, but also to biblical law. People need to be provided for. So even though they're going to divorce their wives, they have to make sure that their families are provided for. "Arise, for this matter belongeth unto thee. We also will be with thee. Be of a good courage, and do it." Then arose Ezra and made the chief priests, the Levites, and all Israel to swear that they should do according to this word, and they swear. And then he goes and kicks Johanan, the son of Elisha, out of the house of God. So there was some stuff going on there that we're going to just skip. And then he says in verse 8, and that whosoever, or verse 7, "And they made a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem unto all the children of the captivity, that they should gather themselves together unto Jerusalem, that whosoever would not come within 3 days, according to the counsel of the princes and the elders, all his substance should be forfeited, and himself separated from the congregation of those that have been carried away." So 2 of the qualifications, so they would be separated and they would have the goods confiscated. He's not offering a death penalty and he's not offering imprisonment. But those are all 2 of the 4 things that Artaxerxes has given them as civil authority. And so for the first time here, Ezra is utilizing this civil authority in this issue of the marriage to the strange wives. And so he makes this decree. And then it says in verse 9, "Then all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered themselves together unto Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the street of the house of God, trembling because of this matter and for the great rain." So in the 9th month is the rainy season. So this is what has happened. And they're going to confess their sins. So we're going to go over here and we're going to put the 20th day of the 9th month up on our line. And we're going to see something. So one is we see that there's 3 days before it. And we have these periods of 3 days. There's 3 days fast at the river Ahava, 3 days after they arrive to Jerusalem, that they wait before they bring the gold and silver to the temple. And over here you can see, well, they say silver and gold. Same thing here. You have silver and gold. And then you have 3 days over here as well. And then you have the 20th day of the 9th month. Now we're going to have some other dates, but the only other date in this year is the first day of the 10th month is going to be mentioned later. And then we'll address that. So anyway, we have these periods of 3 days. Now we had a Bible study group some years ago, and we noticed this period here. And my friend asked, what's in the middle of these periods of 3 days? Because we're trying to understand, how can we nail down the 10th day of the 7th month as the start of the 2300 days when the Bible never gives us that date? But it does give us this date, and it does give us this date. And it does give us these 3 days, and it does give us these 3 days. So we could see here that there's a mirror. So the question was, what's in the middle? Now, just on a simple level, if you go from the first day of the 5th month to the 20th day of the 9th month, you can see that we would have to take this 20 and divide it by 10. So we would have the 10th day of some month. And then you can see between 5 and 9, there's 4 months. So we would just take that and take 2 months on either side of this, and you would have the 7th month. So you can see that the center of this chiasm is, and if you looked at it sort of symbolically, this would be 2 months and 10 days, 2 months and 10 days, and 2 months and 10 days. So this would be 70 days. And this would be 140 days. And the 10th day of the 7th month would be the center of this chiasm. This would be him building, in quotation marks, building the city, that is laying down the civil authority, building the government up, appointing judges and magistrates. And then here he's enacting it. Now, the actual number of days here would be 69 and 69 and 138, because there's months, 2 months in each of these that don't have, there's actually more, but 3 months in here that don't have the 30 days, they have 29. But the point is, we can see this chiasm. Now, this is interesting because we know the 10th day of the 7th month is obviously here, October 22nd, and that this would connect the events of 457 BC symbolically with the events of 1844. So this would be an argument, a biblical argument, that would support the idea that these events here have to be in 457 if you're going to have 2300 days end on October 22, 1844. So I hope that that's clear to people, this idea of this chiasm. Now, I noticed later when I was looking at this history that there's also another period of 3 days. And so in thinking about that, I wondered what's in the middle of this period of 3 days. But when I counted it, it was 107 days, literally. And the center of this was a date we should be familiar with, the 6th day of the 3rd month. Now, this is a period of 54 days, starting here. And so the 6th day of the 3rd month is Pentecost. And Pentecost is the 50th day from the 16th day of the 1st month. That is, it's actually 49 days. Because if you have a Pentecost on Sunday, like we did in the time of Christ, he was crucified a Friday on the 14th of Nisan. On the 15th, he lay in the tomb. And on the morning of the 16th, which is the wave sheaf offering, or the Feast of First Fruits, he arose from the grave. And so that's the 16th. And if you count 7 weeks, it will bring you to the Sabbath 7 weeks later. Or not to the Sabbath, to the Sunday 7 weeks later. But it's called the 50th day because it's the 50th day. It's 49 days cardinally counted, but it's 50 days when you count it ordinally. So this date here is the 50th day. And this is on the biblical calendar, the 6th day of the 3rd month is Pentecost. And it's always Pentecost. The Karaites, they have always the Pentecost on a Sunday. So they have it move around because they want it to be fixed with the weeks to actually be the actual sabbatical weeks. But the Jews do keep the 6th day of the 3rd month. Now, so if this is the 50th day and I count backwards, I would know then that the 16th is the 1st day. And then I would count backwards one more, and the 15th would be the 51st day between here. And then I would go to the 14th, and that would be the 52nd day. And then the 13th of Nisan, because I'm going backwards, would be the 53rd day. And when I got to the 12th day of the 1st month, that would be the 54th day. So on this side, I'm actually counting ordinally. But on this side, I'm just going to count cardinally. And so when I write them, it looks like periods of 54 days, though this side is a little bit shorter. But this is 107 days, and so obviously 107 days doesn't work into equal number of days. I could have written 53 and a half and 53 and a half, I guess. But I'm counting in the biblical sense here. This is the 50th day. So this would be, from here, it'd be the 54th day. So the interesting thing about this is 457 BC. And we already have understood that this date can be understood as a number. It can be understood as the number 54. So remember, when we took the first day of the first month, we took that as 11. Fifth day of the fourth month is 54. First day of the fifth month is 15. The 10th day of the seventh month is 107. And we added them together and they became 187 days. But also here in this history, we have midnight, symbolized by the fifth day of the fourth month. Here is the number 54, and it's doubled, which is also a symbol of midnight. And then we have 107 days, which is a symbol of the 10th day of the seventh month, both in this history and in this history, which is the center of this chiasm. So we have two chiasms here in 457 BC that symbolically represent this chiasm here in 1844. Now, so this is not a scholarly argument. No scholar would ever present such an argument to try to convince other scholars. Now, I went a little bit long on this first part, but you may want to take a break. So I'm going to just take a break quickly. I'm going to pause the recording, and we'll be right back in just like 3 minutes. Dear Father in heaven, again, we just ask for your Spirit. Help us in this as we round the final bend in this study, that you can bring things together, that we can see clearly what it is that we need to understand and how to present this message. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, so now we have these two chiasms. And this chiasm here, Pentecost, Ellen White makes the statement that when the Holy Spirit was poured out, so this connects with the 70 weeks. This connects with the 2,300 days. The 70 weeks marks a prophecy that deals with Christ's work as our sacrifice and also as our high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. Ellen White says that when the Holy Spirit was poured out on the disciples in the book of Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, that Christ inaugurated his work as our high priest in the heavenly sanctuary in the holy place. And we do know as Seventh-day Adventists that Christ then on October 22nd moved from the holy to the most holy place. And so the fact that you have these two chiasms that point to that work, first the work that begins of the daily ministration of Christ, and then the symbol for his work in the investigative judgment, is extremely profound. Now, if Adventists had found this out earlier, I don't know if it would be as powerful as it is now, because it's not something we expected. We didn't build our arguments of the 2,300 days in investigative judgment upon this close analysis of this chronology. But now that we can go back and look at this, what we're doing is we're examining the foundation that was laid. And when we examine that foundation, we find that it was laid correctly, that things fit in ways that we couldn't have imagined. And this study here, to me, was an extremely powerful study. One is because we did it in our Bible study group, and it wasn't just, me figuring something out. We were now, as a group, studying these things, figuring out, and for the people who figured those things out, that became an anchor for them to continue to study and understand this message. And so I think it's important that, we have that personal study. Now, I do want to look at some of the chronological details that really I've left out in this study. And when we look at the notes here, I just want to quickly look at them myself here, as we have all this chronology. I do have a drawing of this, the periods of time. I deal with 457 BC in looking at it in some ways. More light from 457 BC. I deal with these chiasms. And then I have the questions and answers. So we're going to kind of sum this up by going back to the assignment from last week. So last week I wanted people to use these calendars and these tools. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to look at the Babylonian calendar. So this here, and so in the book Babylonian Chronology by Parker and Duberstein, we have here's Artaxerxes' years. So just like we did with in other studies, we looked at this Babylonian chronology. One thing you'll see is that the first year of Artaxerxes is 464 BC, and Adventists always acknowledge this. So, which is kind of a funny point, because they'll acknowledge it's 464, so that they're not disagreeing with what things are saying, but when they don't give you the details to recognize the problem. So if you go here, you'll see his 7th year is 458. So they're just saying that his year would start in the fall, but it doesn't. If you look at the Babylonian chronology, the month Nisan, the first year of Artaxerxes, begins on the 13th day of the 4th month in 464 BC. So if you continue going through and you get to the 7th year, it would begin on the 8th of April in 458. And then that means his 8th year would begin on March 27th, 457. So if Ezra was traveling in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, according to this chronology, he would not have been traveling in the year 457. He would have been traveling in the year 458. Now, the way that Samuel Snow addressed this, part of it was a problem, a misunderstanding that he had. So he was using, I can't think of the chronologist's name, but he was using a chronology where the chronologist had a 0 year in between BC and AD dates. And that was confusing him. And he had made a number of mistakes along the way. So those mistakes really were not corrected early on in Adventism. Ellen White seems to always uses the correct language. She seemed to understand it. But she doesn't explicitly try to correct people. So people would often read Ellen White and still have a misunderstanding of it. Now, we're making the argument that based on Nehemiah, so that's our one biblical argument that we have, that we can try to address at least the possibility that Nehemiah recognized that the 20th year of Artaxerxes began in the fall of 445 and ended in the fall of 444 BC, not in the spring. Otherwise, Nisan would have been in his 21st year. So that's a good argument. But we have these other powerful arguments that can connect these histories together. So we can take the history in 457 BC and connect it with the history in 1844 and show coincidences regarding the dates that are listed in Ezra, the first day of the first month, the first day of the 5th month, the 10th day, and use that 20th day of the 9th month to show the 10th day of the 7th month is the center of a chiasm. Obviously, connecting the first day of the 1st month and the first day of the 5th month in Millerite history is extremely powerful. But it's the chiasm between the 12th day of the 1st month and the 1st day of the 5th month that gives us the symbols of the 5th day of the 4th month that we find in 1844, the Boston sermon. So I want you to draw your attention to then this, what was called the 8th year of Artaxerxes. And you can see that in 457, that the Babylonian calendar started on the 27th day of the 3rd month. Now, of course, that's March 27th. And we now understand that March 27th is a symbol. And it's a symbol of the Levites. Now, we make the case that there are 2 different dates that could be used here and that it's very, very close because we take the position that the biblical calendar commences with the first new moon after the spring equinox. So you would have to look for the visible crescent on the evening of what they would classify as the day that the spring equinox had actually occurred. Now, it would occur earlier than that in a technical sense, but how they declared it, they would have declared it the evening before that it was now the day of the equinox, and then the next evening, if they saw the first visible crescent, it would have been after the spring equinox. But if they have the visible crescent sighted at the same evening that you would have now declared the next day is the first day of the equinox, then you would have to add a 13th month. Now, this is something that is a bit speculative exactly how they did this. When you have it so close in that way, how do you know that the weather wasn't bad, that they didn't actually, that they might have seen the new moon? They didn't see the new moon on that night. And so they have to wait till after the spring equinox, and maybe there might be years where they added that 13th month just based upon the atmospheric conditions, clouds, that had them delay the start of the year one day, which would make them start the year 1 month later. So you have these things that are, speculative. You can't prove, I can't prove even here that in 457 that the first day of the first month was not March 27th, and that rather it was April 26th. Now, April 26th, of course, is already a symbol of the 26th day of the fourth month. So we have two symbols here, 264 and 273, that exist in 457 BC. Now, this is a powerful argument for us that these two symbols exist together. Now,
we also have 525.
525 with the start of the third month.
Yes.
Yeah, so the start of Sivan is going to be the 25th day of the fifth month. Yeah, and you also have the 24th day of the sixth month, and if you write it in that area, it's the 420. Well, it's a mixture of the 264. It's not exactly in the right order. You could do it though 426, the other way around. You could do it like a mirror. So yeah, there's some interesting things here, and who even knows? Maybe the biblical year. Maybe the next month. I haven't tried it out, but for the month of Av, maybe it was also the 7th month, 23rd day. So that would be interesting. But here on the Babylonian calendar, it's the 24th day of the 7th month, so the 24th of July. But that's kind of an interesting point, is we have some of these details. Now, I've made an argument that the beginning of this year, 457 BC, on the biblical calendar is the 26th day of the fourth month on our calendar. So it is April 26th. And I agree with Olivier. He makes the same argument. I think it's a good argument. And what we see then, and I've shown this other times, is that if you take all of the years on the prophetic mirror, including 457 BC, and we also have the same thing in 1844. In 1844, they added a 13th month, and the nearness of the equinox to the sighting of the first visible crescent in both of these years is very similar. So if you're going to add a 13th month in 1844 to move the Passover from April 3rd to May 2nd, to move the 10th day of the 7th month from September 23rd to October 22nd, you would have the same thing happen here. Now, the difference is, this is a Julian calendar, and the Julian calendar drifts. That is, the equinoxes at this time are a little bit later on the calendar. So we know right now, I think the equinox is on the 19th of March this year. Back in this time, and that's a drift that's happening that's going to be corrected once we get that, we miss that extra leap year at the end of the 21st century. But anyway, so here in 457, we have a match with 1844 as far as how the calendar is calculated. The first new moon after the spring equinox, it means that there's going to be a 13th month added in 1844, and the same thing occurs in 457. And it occurs with all of the years on the prophetic mirror. 742, 723, 677, 457 BC are all identical. And then when you get into the AD years, 538, 1798, 1844, and 1863 also have the same characteristic, that the equinox and the first visible crescent necessitate on a very close margin that you need to add a 13th month prior to the start of that year. And the chances that it's going to occur by randomly picking dates is extremely unlikely. So that's one of the things that we're going to put these dates then in Artaxerxes. And just to show you some of this again, I showed it last time, but I do really want people to try to use these tools. So if I go to 457, so I'd go minus 0, 456, and then I would need to go, right now I'm here in January, I can use this month, move it over, and you can see in March, the new moon here is on the 25th, in that top right corner on the 25th of March. But that's not the first sighting of the first visible crescent. That's just the conjunction. And then you can see the spring equinox occurs, and this is not the way the Jews would determine it, but it occurs at 7:14 a.m. local time. So that's the spring equinox. And then what you would have to determine is when the new moon is going to be sighted. Well, if the new moon is sighted on the evening of the 26th, this would then be too soon, because it's not really after the spring equinox. You would determine the spring equinox that evening as being the 27th. So on the evening of the 26th, you would say the next day is the spring equinox. But you would also then say the next day is the first day of the next month. When you do that and they're together like that, the conclusion that I've drawn and other people have drawn is that then that would be the next day of the first day of the 13th month. So March 27 would be the beginning of the 13th month, and you would have to add that extra month. And then you would come around again to April. And when you go to April, you would see, once again, you're going to have to sight the first visible crescent. Now, based on the moon's anomaly, sometimes the first visible crescent can be seen quite soon after conjunction. Sometimes it can be seen quite late. In this case, it would be seen quite late. It would not have been seen until the 25th. Now, of course, when you look at when the conjunction is, it's on the 23rd, and it's at 9:51, I think it says, p.m. So it wouldn't be seen on the evening of the 24th. It'd be too soon. On the evening of the 25th, it would have been visible in Jerusalem. And so the 26th day of April would be the first day of the first month in 457 BC. And so just these coincidence of these dates that we already have as symbols are pretty powerful. I wouldn't necessarily use them, when I'm presenting it to somebody for the first time. This is probably going to confuse them. Well, I'm saying I shouldn't. I probably would. But you probably shouldn't. But some people can be interested in those little details too. So I think that sort of helps, or should help people to recognize that there is this, if we're going to go here, we have this connection between 457 and 1844, in that both of them have a 13th month that precedes them. So there's going to be a 13th month here that's going to precede the first day of the first month. And then we have the 26th day of the fourth month on our calendar, the Julian calendar, that commences this year. So again, that symbol that's there. And so if we're gonna match this to 1844, we know 1844, the first day of the first month, is 7 days difference because this is April 19th. And so these dates are all going to be 7 days later. So the 10th day of the 7th month would be October 29th. The first day of the 5th month would be August 22nd. In 1844, August 22nd is when he published the True Midnight Cry magazine. We would also have here the 6th day of the 3rd month. This is June 22nd in 1844. And we know that's tied with the June 27th publishing of Samuel Snow's letter. So he has his 3rd letter written on June 22nd. It gets published June 27th. But the June 18th letter, or July 18th letter, pardon me, that's published 3 days before midnight, 3 days here, this letter. This one's actually written on July 29th. Well, this date here in 457 BC, which is June 29th, pardon me, couldn't be written after it's published. On June 29th, this is June 22nd in 1844. So you got over here the 6th day of the 3rd month, and this is June 22nd. But in this history, it's going to be 7 days later, so it's June 29th. And this letter here was written on June 29th. So this is written on the 29th, and it's published July 18th. So it's interesting that you have, in all, we can connect the writing of Samuel Snow's letters to the dates on the Julian calendar in some of this history. And again, a highly unlikely occurrence that you're going to have a few of those dates all line up. So pretty interesting as far as the symbolism that's here. But when you strip it down just to its simplicity, what you're doing is you're showing somebody, after you've gone through parts of Ezra, you show them the Cyrus's decree, you show them Darius's decree, you can now spend time establishing this history. And I would establish it before you really even get into this history. So, here I just kind of jumped and compared them because we should know both. But I would really want a person to get to know this history first. And then you would take them into this history and start to compare back here. So the person can start to see there's this connection between what happened in 457 BC and what happened in 1844. And there's different ways you could do it. You might even skip out the Pentecost part of the chiasm and bring this in later after you've established Millerite history, then bring this to sort of put the final touches and bring everything together. But first focus on the 10th day of the 7th month and its connection here. And that's probably the best way to do it. It just depends who you're studying with, how much they know. If they know Millerite history already, which there isn't many people unless they're in this movement. I often just compare them because I'm presenting it to people in this movement. But if you're somebody who doesn't really understand this history at all, to bring them to the 10th day of the 7th month, to establish something like this, and then to go back over this history, and then bring in the first day of the 5th month, and start to lay down then midnight and so forth. And then really the pièce de résistance would be Samuel Snow's letters, which would then tie in a whole bunch of other elements. So Samuel Snow's letters tie in Cyrus's decree, they tie in Darius's decree, and they tie in, of course, Artaxerxes' decree. So Samuel Snow's letters has a bunch of history that ties back to these stories here in the book of Ezra. Now, so let's look at next week's assignment. And so we go back to our notes. So, this is your assignment, but I'm going to kind of just look ahead. And any comments that people want to have, any questions, we definitely welcome them. So let's go over some of these questions. So even though this is your assignment, I'm going to kind of give you something more. Actually, even before we look at this assignment, I just want to see how much time we have. So we got about 20 minutes. So let's actually go back to last week's assignment. So we had this questions and answers. Why was Cyrus's first year called his third year? The significance of the year 538. But mostly what I wanted people to do was to use the Torah calendar and using the rules, the following rules for biblical calendar, give the dates on the Julian calendar for the first day of the first month, 12th day of the first month, 6th day, third month, first day, fifth month, 10th day, seventh month, 20th day, ninth month, first day, 10th month in 457 BC, and the first day of the fifth month in 456 BC. Now, I didn't actually touch on that part of it. So let's just go, let's actually go back to this calendar here. Maybe we'll go to the Bible first. So one of the things I left out when you go to Ezra 10, so they decide, they meet, they confess their sins, and they came within 3 days, and on the 20th day of the 9th month, they had confessed all their sins. So now they're going to have to decide what to do. And so they pick some of the sons of the priests who had taken some strange wives, and they gave their hands that would put away their wives. And being guilty, they offered a ram with a flock of their trespass. So there's a bunch of things that are going to go on. Where is this next part? It might be in the next chapter. Yeah. No, there is no next chapter. So it's got to be here somewhere. Where is it? Oh, here it is, verse 16 and 17. And the children of the captivity did so, and Ezra the priest, with certain chief of the fathers after the house of their fathers, and all of them by their names, were separated, and sat down in the first day of the 10th month to examine the matter. So they have basically set up these people to do the judge. They're employed in the matter of judging. That's what he talks about in verse 14. These people who are appointed judges. And they made an end with all the men that had taken strange wives by the first day of the first month. So an interesting thing here about this history is that from the first day of the first month, we start with Ezra leaving Babylon, and we finish on the first day of the first month of the next year with the strange wives being dealt with. So this is a pretty interesting point. Now we also have something that happens that I'm just going to write it up here on the board, that we had noticed if we took the dates on this line, first day of the first month, fifth day of the fourth month, first day of the fifth month, 10th day of the seventh month, and we added them together, we got 187. The period from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the seventh month. Now in this history here, I found that we could do something similar. These are all the dates in this year that are given. Now we get the date, the first day of the first month for the next year. But if I take all of these numbers, first day of the first month, the 12th day of the first month, the 6th day of the, not that one because that one wasn't given to us, first day of the 5th month, we weren't given the 10th day of the 7th month, but we were given the 20th day of the 9th month. Now, in the 20th day of the 9th month, and we're given this one, the first day of the 10th month, I'm going to cross out these zeros because we can remove zeros. And then I'm going to add them together. So the numbers that I get, 121 plus 11 is 133, 148, add 29, that would be 177, and then I would add 11, and that would be 187. So I think I did something wrong. Yes, I did. That would be not 8, that would be 7. So that would be 132, 167, 176, and I'd add 11, that'd be 187. So these would also add up to 187. Of course, doing stuff people might think is a little bit odd, dropping the zeros in this case, because we don't in this case. But the thing is, we can do this. And so this is just another testimony that we have this connection between this line and this line. Now, so I just wanted to show you that. Well, let's go back to, so we got that part of it, dealing with the dates. And so now when we look at some of these ideas, so just getting my mouse over here. So we go back to the questions, the assignment for next week. So what events mark the commencement of the 70 weeks and the 2300 days? What are dates and events marks the completion of the 70 weeks? So what I'm asking people to do is just to take a bit of time to go through and look at the events. Now, obviously, we know that Pentecost and the Day of Atonement in 457 BC, they may have observed Pentecost. But the Day of Atonement, we know that they didn't observe it at that time because when we go to the story of Nehemiah, we also find that in Nehemiah's time, they didn't observe the Day of Atonement. They got out the book of the law, they found that they weren't keeping the Day of Atonement, and they mourned because they couldn't keep it. And why would they not be able to keep the Day of Atonement in 457 BC or in 444 BC? Anybody know? Because they have the temple. The temple was built, dedicated in 515. Why can they not have the Day of Atonement? Why can they not practice it? Any ideas? So what furniture, per piece of furniture, is absolutely necessary to keep the Day of Atonement?
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant.
Right, the Ark of the Covenant. And where's the Ark of the Covenant in 457 BC, 34?
Yeah, Jeremiah had it buried in a cave.
So it's hidden. So they don't have it. And this is an interesting point, because when we think about the restoration of the temple and the restoration of the Jews under these three decrees, the one thing we don't really often recognize is that the cleansing of the sanctuary cannot occur in this history because they don't have the ark in the sanctuary. So whether they ever tried to make another one to replace it, I don't know of any record of that happening. Definitely, they didn't have the ark that Moses was given from the original temple. And so the cleansing of the sanctuary cannot really literally be fulfilled, but also it's not going to be fulfilled till the end of time in the heavenly sanctuary. So, because that's really where Paul says that that's the temple that's defiled with the blood that defiles the heavenly sanctuary. The heavenly sanctuary has to be cleansed with better sacrifices than the earthly sanctuary was. So it's an interesting point, and I haven't seen a lot of people ever address it. We always talk about, we read Hebrews, Paul talks about the temple that it has the ark and it has, but it's never really talked about. Like, he's talking about the original tabernacle. The sanctuary that existed in Paul's day wouldn't have had the actual ark, even if it had some kind of replica. It wouldn't have been the ark that was originally given. And so they may have actually put a replica in there. I can't remember, there's the Roman bas relief where they show them carrying the candlestick and some of the furniture from the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And I can't remember if it shows the ark on there or not, whether it just shows the altar and some of these other things, the laver and so forth. But even if it did, whether that would be a representation of the actual ark, I don't think so. Ellen White says that the ark is still in its hiding place. So anyway, we have this in 457 BC, we have things that we may not have thought of. So it's just something to think about. I don't know how important it is, but we have this connection between 457 BC and 1844. And so trying to understand that connection is something that is the main thing that I think supports that the only thing that fulfills this prophecy is to understand 457 BC. Now, with the calendar, I'm asking people for next assignment to try to use it. And these dates are going to be the dates connected with Samuel Snow's letters. And there's the 26th day of the 11th month in 1844, the 3rd day of the 12th month, the 14th day of the 13th month, the 1st day of the 1st month, the 14th day of the 1st month, 6th day of the 3rd month, 5th day of the 4th month, 1st day of the 5th month, and 10th day of the 7th month. And so I want you to try to give me the dates of these. Now, these are a bit easier because some of you are familiar, of course, with the 1st day of the 1st month. But something like the 26th day of the 11th month, I want to see what dates you come up with, or the 3rd day of the 12th month, and see how those line up with Samuel Snow's letters. Any final questions?
Did anyone do the assignment last week?
Yeah. Did anyone do it? It's a good question. Did you do it, Stephen?
No, I intended to, but the week just flew in, and
Yeah. Well,
I just realized, oh no, the assignment's going to be in.
yeah, I mean, I know you know how to do it to some degree. I just think that, we need to check out these things. So we worked out this calendar converter that Troy Van Horn put up, and there's still some problems with it. He didn't do everything that I asked him to do, but he did so much. I'm very thankful to him that he did it and that he has kept it up. And he's also given me permission to use it. We can put it on our own website. I would like to tweak it and correct it. So one of the things about it is in the biblical calendar, the way that I understand it is that the months go 30 and 29, but once you get to the 7th month, it could either have 30 or 29. Whether that was always done or whether that was just done at the time of Christ, we don't know. But sometimes you'll have these dates for the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th month that might be off a day from what I have. Now, the Babylonians always did it by observance, though they're in Babylon, but Babylon is their, visible crescent is very close to what happens in Jerusalem, though obviously weather could affect that. But, I have some dates that when I look at them on the calendar converter, I know they're wrong because they weren't corrected for observation from the end of the 7th month. So from the start of the 8th month all the way to the start of the 13th month, they weren't adjusted for that. And so they might be off by a day. And some of them are difficult to figure out. We also have the TorahCalendar.com, and it shows the first visible crescent in Jerusalem. When you start to go back into the past, that becomes a little bit different. You can drift off a little bit, and there's different theories or different disagreements people have about calculating things way in the past. Obviously, as you're closer to the present, we're going to be more accurate. So we know that we can be off by a day, right? And we could even be off by 2 days, and maybe even in a whole month in some years if there was, we added a leap month and maybe they didn't. We also know that, like during the story of the flood, it appears that they would have used the full moon falling after the 14th, or the 14th falling after the full moon, the other way around. Yes, full moon is going to be later in the month. And that so you can create a month where you're using the full moon as your guide. And the nice thing about the full moon, of course, is it's not as dependent upon observation. because if you're familiar with observing the moon, even if you don't see the moon that day, you can know what phase it's in, just by understanding the pattern. So people in the past, in the ancient past, people obviously before the flood, would have had no problem knowing, probably even months in advance, what the dates would be. But obviously they lost that, and that's when I think they adopted observing the visible crescent. It was an easier way to do it, less math involved, and you just observe it, and then you just have your 10th day of the 7th month, 187 days later. So this is, this is a problem that people will sometimes get a little picky about. We also know that the Millerites in 1844, and this is another point that you want to think about, is they, and I don't know if we're going to look at it. I don't think we look at it here in too much detail. I might have it in a footnote. But they didn't understand that the Jewish calendar went 30-29, 30-29. They thought each month was observed. And so when they got to the 7th month, they observed, and maybe I'll just address this point here, because I think it's an important point. So it didn't really end up mattering in the end, but it seemed to matter to them. So if you put these days here, and you put October 22, we know that this is the 10th day of the 7th month. So you have 21, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13. And people had just as much trouble doing math as we do today. People made a lot of mental errors when they were trying to figure this out. So we can now, if you draw this out this way, you would see that the 13th day of October lines up with the first day of the 7th month of Tishri, right? So that's pretty easy to see. Now what they did is they didn't know that they could just count to get to the 10th day of the 7th month once they found the first day of the 1st month. And they weren't even really sure about how to count the first day of the 1st month. And there's a discrepancy, which, because they didn't actually do it according to the rules that were done in the time of Christ. They did them to some earlier rules. They used a mixture of ideas from the Karaite calendar and the rabbinic calendar. And they had a misunderstanding of the Karaite calendar. But what they did is they used Boston. So they didn't use Jerusalem for the sighting of the first visible crescent. They wanted to use Boston. And in their understanding then, when they saw the first visible crescent, and they weren't even really sure about the visible crescent, they were trying to use their understanding of it. They used the Farmer's Almanac to figure this out, because they didn't wait till October to figure out that it was going to be October 22nd. But there were some people who actually thought it was going to be October 23rd. It was going to be the 10th day of the 7th month. And it was when they got here that they sort of resolved that issue. But then they would have seen the visible crescent on the evening of the 12th, which would make this the first day of the 1st month. The point is they used Boston, not Jerusalem. If you used Jerusalem, you would come to a different conclusion. And this also applies in 1809 when you're studying Josiah Litch's prophecy. If you try to line the 26th day of the 4th month up with July 27th, 1809, it doesn't work if you use the proper biblical calendar. The first day of the 1st month, instead of being April 4th, like it is every other time when the year is July 27th on the 26th day of the 4th month, it ends up being April 3rd as being the first day of the 1st month. But if you use Boston, then it does line up that the first day of the 1st month is April 4th, and the 26th day of the 4th month is July 27th. And that's in the Julian calendar, of course, in 1809 that we would do that. So these little discrepancies, these are points where people, one is you have room for doubt. So somebody might look up something in the calendar converter saying, this doesn't work out. They might see that I use a date here and they might not understand the reasoning behind it. And so people might think, well, you're just moving things around to fit your ideas. And I haven't done that. I've actually tried to understand when there are discrepancies or apparent discrepancies, why they exist. And the reasons that they exist, I mean, one is we know we can't go back in the past and say we know definitely which day they kept, as the Day of Atonement in every single year, because they could have used faulty reasoning at the time. They could have used a different method. They could have used the Babylonian calendar during the times they're in Babylonian captivity, or even before that, or way after that. So we don't know. We don't know how well they kept those rules. We know that they changed over time. But God wasn't that concerned about rules. And there's this one little argument, which I'm trying to use as I close, that there were people who understood that if you go to 1844 and you follow these biblical rules that I gave you, and you look at the Torah calendar, and you look at the Skyview Cafe, you'll realize that the first day of the first month, based on, that's kind of hard to explain. And also, I should mention Grace Amidon's rules, that if you follow the same rules that she uses in 31 AD to move the first day of the first month one day later, that doesn't apply in 1844. That is, if you tried to do it the same rules in 31 AD, you would actually have April 20th as the first day of the first month, not April 19th. And you would have October 23rd as the 10th day of the seventh month. And so some people have made the argument that when Hiram Edson went out after praying in the early morning on the 23rd, and he saw Jesus moving from the holy to the most holy place, that if the 23rd of October was the 10th day of the seventh month, then Jerusalem, which was like 7 hours earlier, something like that, it's I think a bit more, but it's sometime earlier than it was, I think maybe it's 7 hours, that would have matched up with later in the day, because it would be later in the day in Jerusalem, with Hiram Edson actually seeing Christ move on the 23rd of October. So I've run into Adventists who have made this argument. Now I just want to say something. Let's say the Millerites were wrong, that they didn't understand the calendars correctly. I believe that God would have honored them in that, because calendars, the way we understand the world is there has to be a calendar that's exactly right. And if we're off a little bit, then there's something wrong. But to the ancient mind, that doesn't make sense. If everybody thinks it's the Day of Atonement, it's the Day of Atonement. Even if they calculated the calendar wrong, or they missed out on seeing the first visible crescent that they should have seen, or maybe they're using the wrong rules at that time, God honors the fact that we are limited creatures. He is not expecting that we have to get that date right to the day. Now, we can look back on history and we can use these rules and we can ascertain that these calendars give us these dates. But who knows what could have happened in the past, what the weather was like at that time for that month, whether they observed it every month or not. We can't know for certain. The only thing I can show is that when I follow these rules, which I got from the Bible by looking at these calendars, they seem to have everything fit. They made 1844 fit, they made 31 AD fit, they made everything fit and agree with one another. And so these rules I fleshed out by comparing exact chronology as much as I possibly could. But even doing that doesn't mean I'm 100% correct. And so we have to be careful when we look at these things, because we're dealing with symbols. And so I believe October 22nd, 1844 was the 10th day of the seventh month. Don't get me wrong on that. But I do believe that even if it wasn't correct, some of the attacks that people have against Adventists, let's say it was supposed to be September 23rd, just like the Jews and the Karaites kept in 1844. Well, they didn't follow the prophecies, and they didn't look for the Day of Atonement and the close of, the second coming on September 23rd. And they looked for it on October 22nd. And that's what God cares about. That's what fulfilled prophecy. So I think it's an important point that we can't look at the world from a Greek and Roman mind and understand biblical prophecy. We have to look at it from a Jewish mind. And it's much different than our way of thinking. So any final comments before we close with prayer?
Jeff made a statement today in his presentation. I didn't see the whole, well, I didn't watch it live,
Okay.
but I watched it recorded, and it was very badly edited. There seemed to be a lot of problems. Like, I think it was only like 43 minutes long.
Oh,
And I don't know whether they're going to put another one up with the full
okay. Yeah.
sermon, or else there looks to have been, it hasn't been recorded right. There's lots of glitches and it was
Okay.
jumping in. So,
Okay.
but anyway, I was able to observe what Jeff said, that he said that in 1844, he was speaking about the the first disappointment.
Yeah.
In April 1844, and he was basically saying that the disappointment was caused not so much by the year 1843 being fulfilled, but it was more the disappointment for the people that had left, the sort of the division that occurred between the Millerites and the Protestants.
Mm.
To me, that was kind of new. I thought it was always going to be the disappointment that Christ didn't come in 1843. Now, what's your perspective on what Jeff said?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I agree with him. I mean, obviously, there would be a disappointment there. But I would think that the people in the Millerite movement, the diehard ones, they continued on. So, you would have been moving with your friends. It would have been more the nominal people who are just kind of not really part of the Millerite movement who fell away when, progressively also March 21st when it had passed, and then April 19th. So I don't know. Obviously, the mocking occurred, and Samuel Snow writes about it in his May 1st letter, which isn't really part of his letters. So Samuel Snow writes about that, the mocking that was occurring. So I don't know if I agree with him. Maybe, as far as the mocking is concerned, I mean, that obviously would be a difficult part. But I would think it would be, Jesus didn't come back. Their expectations has been dashed based upon all the writings I read that the Millerites say. First they had two things. They had to address the fact, what do we tell people? This is a bit humiliating. So there was that discouragement. But also they said our expectations have been dashed, right? So, our expectations at the year 1843. So that had passed. We read that quote earlier. So I would think that, it obviously is a mixture of the two. The interesting discussion that they had, we can maybe get later. I want to kneel for prayer so we can close off the study, and then we can have a little bit of a conversation on some other things. Okay, so let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this study. I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully we've gone through it slow enough that we can understand it, maybe even for the first time. And help us to continue as we study, to pull these things together, to understand them in their fullness. Help us to continue to learn and grow so that we can bless others. And help us in the time ahead that we know many trials will come, and we ask for your strength and help. And bring us together again to study, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So.